Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Today, and another View history lesson. Have you ever heard of Pauli Murray? She was an African-American visionary activist, lawyer, and priest. She refused to sit in the back of the bus and organized sit-ins at restaurants years before Rosa Parks or the Greensboro sit-ins. She was an African-American first in many of her occupations and was even named a saint by the Episcopal Church. And she was a member of the LGBTQ community. Get ready to learn about an unsung hero. The story of Pauli Murray and another View history lesson is next, so stay tuned.
Discussing today's topics from an African-American perspective, this is Another View.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. You know, one of the cool things about doing this radio show is that we have the opportunity to expose some young people to the careers in radio, and we want to welcome Sierra and Hallie Fong Horvath. I hope I pronounced that correctly. They are from Oakland, California. They're rising high school seniors, and they've also already participated in youth radio with one of our sister stations, KQED in Oakland. So we want to welcome them to Another View and thank them for joining us today. So I was in Durham, North Carolina a few months ago at my favorite bed and breakfast, Moorhead Manor, and innkeeper Monica Edwards told me about a reception being held at the inn for the opening of the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice. The childhood home of Pauli Murray has recently been designated as a national treasure by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and that the building is now being used for dialogue, learning, and the arts. And then I learned that Duke University and the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute is the home of the Pauli Murray Project's initiatives, which offers classes in race and place in Durham, LGBTQ history and activism, independent studies projects, community dialogues, and so much more. So my next question was, who is Pauli Murray? To answer that question and bring us in Another View history lesson is Barbara Lau, Project Director for the Pauli Murray Project. Hi, Barbara. How are you?
Hi, Barbara. I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing great. Well, you know, you and I hit it off right away because we are very worried about the preservation of our name. So, Absolutely. So, tell our audience then, and we're going to get deep into her history, but who is Pauli Murray and how come she did so much for civil rights and so much for women's rights and is so unsung?
Exactly where I was going to start. Pauli Murray is the most important 20th century human rights activist that you probably have never heard of. She was born in Baltimore in 1910 and lived until 1985. And as you suggest, she has been involved in civil rights, women's rights, certainly by her lived experience, LGBTQ rights. She was a lawyer, an activist, a poet, a public speaker, an educator, a writer. She was so many things, and one of the reasons we maybe don't know about her is because she did cross over into all of those arenas, and in fact, was a bit disruptive, right? So she criticized the civil rights movement for not acknowledging the leadership roles of women. She criticized the women's movement for not really attending to the needs of women of color and working class women. She was someone who charted a space kind of between a lot of these movements, but toward a much more holistic, integrated, as she in her life sought an integrated body, mind, and spirit. And then finally, in her later life, she was actually ordained as the first African-American priest in the Episcopal Church. So a woman of great accomplishment, but also a woman of great challenge.
And actually, the Episcopal Church even named her a saint recently.
That's right. In 2012, she was added to what's called the Book of Holy Women, Holy Men, a celebration of saints. And every year in Durham, this year it'll be on June 28th, we celebrate her at St. Titus Episcopal, which is the home church of her family.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to the beginning. Then she was born in my hometown of Baltimore, and she started out with a pretty rough childhood in terms of what happened with her parents and so forth. Can you tell us the story?
That's right. Her mother, Agnes, was a nurse. Her father, William, was an educator. Agnes had 6 children relatively quickly and unfortunately passed away not long after the sixth child was born. Pauli was the fourth of those. Her father had a very hard time dealing with this, full-time job, 6 kids, also had some health issues and ended up in Crownsville Hospital in Maryland and later was killed there by a guard. So Pauli became an orphan at a fairly young age. She went to live in Durham, came here to live in Durham with her namesake, Aunt Pauline Fitzgerald Dame, at the age of 4.
Mm-hmm. And when she came there to live, she went through school in Durham and so forth. And I guess her beginnings of her activism started as she tried to enter college.
Well, actually, I would argue that it was in that household, right? With Pauline Fitzgerald Dame, who was a longtime teacher, and her grandparents. Robert Fitzgerald was a Union Army veteran. He was someone who came south after the Civil War to fight what he called the Second Great War, the war against ignorance. He was a teacher. He was a promoter of citizenship. He was also a farmer and a brickmaker. He convinced his entire mixed-race family to move down after him in Pennsylvania in the 1870s, and then they moved from Hillsborough to Durham when Durham was beginning to boom because of the interest in the tobacco industry. Mm-hmm. Her grandmother, also a mixed-race person, this time by a non-consensual relationship, an enslaved woman named Harriet and a member of the family, Sidney Smith, who owned her, but also a fiery spirit, someone who really did try to chart both, as Pauli later called it, the degradation and dignity of all my ancestors in how she thought about who she was. So Pauli really grew up in an activist family, and a family with strong ideas and philosophies, and a family of great pride related to their African-American heritage. And so that really shaped her through school. She was not the kid who fit in all the time, but she was a really smart young woman. She had a paper route. She contributed to her family. She learned to read very young. That was really nurtured by her grandfather.
And she was 5 years old when she learned to read.
Right. She would read the newspaper to him. So, throw you right into the current events of the day. But she also, her grandfather lost his sight due to an injury he sustained during the war. And one of Pauli's jobs as a young woman was to lead her grandfather into town. And so she also witnessed the sort of re-inscription of all of those segregation laws during Jim Crow. To, sort of happy her grandfather couldn't see all of this after all of his work, but a keen observer of what was happening around her, very aware. So her great uncle, Robert's brother, Richard Fitzgerald, became, through his business exploits, one of the richest black men in the state of North Carolina. He was a landowner. He was a business owner. He helped to found Mechanics and Farmers Bank. So Pauli witnessed as a young child what was possible when people had opportunity, but also the ways that that segregation and laws based on race could hurt people. So she really got a well-rounded education, both in school and in her community as a young woman.
What happened to the rest of her sisters and brothers?
So they grew up in Baltimore. Okay. Some of them went on to have careers in nursing and in education. She also had a brother who unfortunately really suffered a lot of mental illness. But she kept in touch with them some, much more difficult in those days when we didn't have all the conveniences we do today. But and many of her relatives actually still live in the Washington and Baltimore area. But people of great aspiration, people have gone into business. She's got a great nephew who's a lawyer. I mean, they kind of run the gamut of different professions.
So after she graduated from high school, she wanted to go to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Correct?
Actually, that was a graduate school thing. She actually wanted to go to Columbia in New York City, only to arrive and find out that Columbia didn't accept women, and to find out that her 11 years of school, which was very common in the South, didn't actually make her eligible. So she had to get another high school degree in Richmond, just outside New York, and then went to Barnard College, graduated from there and right into the Depression, unfortunately. So had a very hard time finding a job, ended up working for the Works Progress Administration as a teacher, getting involved in labor issues, being in the mix. New York was a very lively conversation at that point about politics and economy and justice. So Pauli was really deep in it. And arts. I mean, she started writing a lot of poetry then and connecting with some of the artists from the Harlem Renaissance. And it was later in 1938 when she realized that maybe getting a job would be enhanced by having more education. And her aunts, her Aunt Sally and Aunt Pauline, who raised her, were getting a little older. They wanted her to come back to North Carolina and help take care of them. And so she came back and applied to a sociology program at UNC Chapel Hill that was specifically looking at race relations. And she thought, well, if we're going to look at that, maybe we need to have people in the room who have some experience. So she applied in 1938 and was rejected based on race. But this really was the first time that she sort of campaigned on her own behalf. So she wrote letters to the president of the country, Franklin Roosevelt, which were copied to his wife, Eleanor. She wrote letters to the president of the college. She took her by this time, pretty well-honed writing skills to the press, and really tried to make a big stink of this. Got the NAACP involved to look at her case, but unfortunately, for many reasons, partly having to do with the fact that they couldn't really control her. The NAACP did not choose to take up that case.
When you say that, it's so funny because as you read about her history, you can feel that she was not a person who could necessarily be controlled.
Well, right, and she certainly had a reputation for being difficult. We know how loaded that term is these days.
Absolutely.
But she had political relationships that were on a broad spectrum. By this time, she was also had been involved in relationships with other women, and this was she didn't present in this very feminine, respectable, traditional way. She wasn't married, all these things. That also played into the NAACP's decision. And granted, they had very limited resources, and so they had to pick their cases very carefully. But Pauli was very disappointed by this loss, went on to work for the Workers' Defense League, helping raise money to defend a black sharecropper in Virginia who had been accused of murder and convicted by an all-white jury. This leads her to an interest in law and civil rights law. She meets some of these NAACP lawyers on the road. They're also trying to raise money. And eventually, in 1941, enters law school at Howard University in Washington, D.C. So kind of back home in the sense of her family having roots there as well.
Okay, and she, in 1940, when she was working with the Fellowship for Reconciliation, if I'm not mistaken, am I right in that time? Now, she was arrested in jail for protesting the segregation on buses. Is that right?
That's right. She was riding home with a friend from New York to Durham for Easter, and there were some broken seats in the back of the bus, and they refused to sit on those, and they were eventually arrested and jailed in Petersburg, Virginia, and it was at that point that she actually began to employ some of the techniques she was learning from the Gandhian movement of nonviolent protest. And so she's one of the very first people to actually intentionally use some of those strategies in a protest movement. The case ends up getting knocked down so that, again, it doesn't end up being a case that could be taken to the Supreme Court. Right. That happens later, another woman from Virginia. And so, she ends up, again, having to kind of keep going, right? I mean, this is a common theme in her life, that she'll challenge these institutional racism, she'll challenge these practices, she'll make some headway, but then the door will close, and she will have to look for another door to keep her work going.
So when she got to Howard, and she was in law school, she was the only female in her classes, right?
That's right.
And she challenged the professors and the students in class. Talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. I mean, she had a hard time. She was a very small person, only about 5 feet tall, maybe 100 pounds. And so she didn't have as huge a physical presence in her classes, and her professors wouldn't call on her. And she really had a hard time with that. And then there were events meant to connect these young law students with possibilities through a fraternity that she was shut out of because she was a female. And, they pushed and pushed, and so that just made her more resistant and work harder. And she graduated from Howard at the top of her class. And what came with that distinction, it was a fellowship to continue the study with this idea that if you got another law degree, you would potentially come back to teach. Well, traditionally, that Rosenwald Fellowship allowed the student to go to Harvard University, so she applied to Harvard Law School for this additional education and was rejected this time because of her gender. And despite having letters, she had letters of recommendation from Franklin Roosevelt and Thurgood Marshall.
Wow.
That still did not make it work, so she went to California, to Berkeley, University of California. Berkeley has the Bolt School of Law. She got her what's called the LLM, Masters of Law degree, and ended up doing some work out there specifically about equal opportunity in employment. It's really interesting that she is starting to look at, well, where does this discrimination really come down? And again, based on her own experience, trying to support herself, being from a family of women, trying to support themselves, she starts looking at these issues related to employment and employment discrimination, and how that not only impacts people because of their race, but also because of their gender. And it's while she's at Howard that she coins the term Jane Crow. So beginning to see what we might now call intersectionality, but the ways that these systems of discrimination and oppression overlap, like she's seeing in her life, not just because of her gender, not just because of her race, but also because of her sexuality. I mean, that's not something she talked about publicly, certainly not at that point, but she experienced over and over where people that didn't accept her for who she was.
And do you think that her sexuality was part of the reason also why she is so unsung? Because back at that time, you really could not talk about or present or come out of the closet, as it were?
I think absolutely. I think that there was a sensitivity in the civil rights movement to the issue of respectability, right? Who were our talented tenths? What should they look like? How should they act? Who are our role models? And certainly at this time, of course, homosexuality is considered a mental illness and a crime at this point. It's not till later in the 1970s that those ideas begin to change. And so very much people have to be very, very quiet about this. And Pauli never liked to present in a way that we would associate with feminine. She wore her hair very short. She preferred wearing pants. She
wore pants in the 40s and in the 50s.
And
I mean, women just
did not do that. She was really, even at this point, challenging her gender identity. For her, she wanted to do the things that men did. She wanted to have that kind of position, both work position and sort of political position. And she found herself attracted to women, often very feminine women. And so she was then questioning, well, what is my gender? And again, here she is challenging some ideas, thinking about a new conception of gender way before we have words to describe that we have now. So, Eleanor Holmes Norton, who was later someone that Pauli helped to mentor at Yale Law School or at Yale University, referred to Pauli as someone who pulled history along with her. And I think these are all really good examples of that.
Absolutely. So how did she and Eleanor Roosevelt become friends? Because they became really close friends, didn't they?
They actually did, and they exchanged more than 300 letters over their lifetime. It really happened back in the 1930s when first time that Pauli met her was at a CCC campus, a Civilian Conservation Corps camp for women in Upper New York State, Camp Terra, that Eleanor had advocated for with her husband. And Eleanor came to visit, and Pauli was there, and she didn't stand up when Eleanor came into the dining room, and this was noted by the camp director, who later expelled Pauli. And then later, when later when Pauli was trying to get accepted at UNC, those letters she wrote to Eleanor or to Franklin Roosevelt, she copied to Eleanor. Well, Franklin didn't write back, but Eleanor did, and that was really the beginning of this correspondence. Interesting relationship. There's a great book called The Firebrand and the First Lady, all about this correspondence, but talks about how these women of different races, different generations, that in their relationship, it really pushed both of them. Pushed Eleanor to push Franklin to push for new policies, pushed Pauli to think about strategies. Well, how do you work from outside the system or inside the system? And they really were great friends. Pauli was invited to the White House many, many times. She took many of her relatives from Washington with her, and she was also invited to Hyde Park, to Eleanor's home. And, this correspondence really reveals the evolution of much of our political thought in the 20th century. So it is a great book.
So there are two books actually out right now, or there are many books, but two that come to mind: The Firebrand, as you just mentioned, and The First Lady, Portrait of a Friendship, Pauli Murray, Eleanor Roosevelt, and the Struggle for Social Justice. That's by Patricia Bell Scott. And then Jane Crow, The Life of Pauli Murray by Rosalind Rosenberg. Also back to that whole discussion of gender discrimination in terms of Jane Crow.
The new book is really interesting because Rosalind Rosenberg has spent 20 years poring over Pauli's journals and personal writings and trying to integrate the personal storyline into the public storyline that we know a little bit more about. And so really talking about how some of Pauli's greatest insights really come because of the tension between of trying to sort of hold on to this space between black and white, between male and female, between heterosexual and homosexual, between middle class and working class. That in doing that is where, drawing on her lived experience and her academic research, and that she really comes up with these new ideas and really starts to promote these bigger ideas about the connections between those things and how we can't fight for them separately, how human rights are indivisible, and it's so important that we not sacrifice the rights of one by fighting for the rights of the other, that we do this together. And part of that is, well, where was Pauli Murray going to be able to live, right? What was the world she wanted to live in? She wanted to be in a place where she could reach her full potential, where she could really be who she was. I talk about how she is a woman of our day. She was not really a woman of her own day, right? She was constantly in struggle with the rules and the customs and the structures around her. But today, her messages resonate more deeply than I think they ever have.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the article in The New Yorker says it was Pauli Murray's fate to be both ahead of her time and behind the scenes.
Absolutely. I think that's a great way to put it. That was a great article, too.
Yes.
Talking about some of the books that have come out and some of the new attention that she's gained because of that, but also because what she's saying is now something that really helps us and what we want to hear, what we kind of work people are doing in social justice realm.
So in the 50s, she wrote the state's laws on race and color for the women's division of the Methodist Church. And they thought they were going to get a pamphlet, and they actually wound up with a full book.
Like 900 pages of books, yes. Yeah, so Pauli had a hard time setting up a law practice independently. There were so few women lawyers, it was very difficult. And so the women's division was a real lifesaver when they hired her to do all this research. way before the internet, we have to remind ourselves of all the laws in every state. Thurgood Marshall later called that book the Bible of for civil rights lawyers who are looking for just the right law in just the right place that would gain them the precedence to begin to that journey up to the Supreme Court. And in fact, some of the arguments Pauli developed about the end of segregation in papers she wrote in law school were arguments that were used by the NAACP team in the Brown v. Board case. So again, exactly behind the scenes, providing a lot of intellectual rigor, but not necessarily getting the credit or being publicly acknowledged.
If you're just joining us, we're talking about activist, lawyer, Episcopal priest, and Saint Pauli Murray, and Another View history lesson with Barbara Lau, project director of the Pauli Murray Project at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. If you have any questions about Pauli Murray, give us a call, 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Have you ever heard of Pauli Murray? 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. So I was looking at the timeline on your website, and in 1952, Pauli was a victim of McCarthyism. I couldn't believe this. So she was rejected for a position at Cornell University because the people who supplied her references, Eleanor Roosevelt, Thurgood Marshall, and Philip Randolph, were considered to be too radical. That's just amazing.
It is, absolutely, and at the same time, Pauli is writing a book about her family, about those grandparents that I was talking about.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things, she came back here to Durham when the book was given a local award and gave a really great speech. One of the things she talked about is that The Proud Shoes, the story of an American family, which is that sort of combination history and memoir, was really a way to counteract McCarthyism. Because, one of the basic arguments about McCarthyism was questioning people's loyalty to the U.S. And one of the things Pauli said, which I think is so great, is she said, if you want to understand loyalty, look at African-American family history. Here you have people living in a society ruled by this idea of democracy, being discriminated against because in practice, and yet continuing to be loyal to this ideal and continuing to work very hard to push the country to live into the ideal of democracy. So you want to know about loyalty? Let me show you loyalty. And when you read the book from that point of view, it really makes a lot of sense that this story of these people help us see a much bigger issue. But for then Pauli to be subject to that and to be questioned, I think that just fueled some of the energy and passion she put into that book, which is just an excellent book, excellent read. Again, one of those things way ahead of its time. It's republished in the 1970s after Roots comes out, when the bigger, I would say, white general public begins to recognize the importance of African-American genealogy and family history. But here she is, almost 20 years ahead of that, publishing the book in 1956.
Once again, being way before her time. So I'm trying to move it along because there's so much to her life, and I want to get to her experience as a priest and so forth also. But before then, tell us about how she got to Yale and how she wound up being the first African-American to receive a JSD from Yale.
Well, the late 50s and 60s were a really productive time for her. She was hired into a big law firm. She met her long-term partner, Irene Barlow, there, which was a really stabilizing force in her life. She ends up leaving there to go and teach law in Ghana. She comes back and is invited to Yale University, to their law school, to earn what is called the JSD, which is a PhD degree in law. And she gets really into this issue around employment opportunity, discrimination against women. She really begins to turn her attention to women's issues. At the same time, she's involved in civil rights. She's helping work on the March on Washington and criticizing them because they do not feature any women speaking as political leaders on the dais. So she pushes through. She receives that degree from Yale in 1965 with a dissertation called Roots of the Racial Crisis, Prologue to Policy. So she's starting now to turn her attention to these bigger issues. She gets involved in the ACLU,
and works with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right?
Right, exactly. Ruth wins in a really important case in front of the Supreme Court about women's rights, and she references Pauli Murray in the footnotes, really acknowledging that her whole theory. So one of the things that Pauli does is she takes makes the analogy of the legal arguments that are the root of the civil rights movement, and she uses that same approach to legal arguments for women and women's rights. She's often called, the mother of the feminist legal strategy. And that's part of the reason that her family home was named a National Historic Landmark in 2016, is that really important role. So she fights for the inclusion of sex in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. She begins to really fill out these ideas about women's rights, along with Betty Friedan and several other people, helps to found the National Organization for Women. This is all happening in the 60s. And then is invited to become a professor at Brandeis University, where she helps to found the very first American Studies program. Then it's a personal crisis, right? Yeah. When Irene Barlow passes away in 1973, Pauli takes a really hard look at what she's doing. She and Irene had been very involved, both Episcopalians, in issues around gender in the church. And so she leaves this tenured position. I can't even imagine this at age 62.
Especially after she had struggled so much through her whole life.
Exactly.
I mean, in terms of almost living on the verge of poverty in many times through her life. And then for her to finally be stable and settled, and then she leaves, and here she goes again.
That's right. Goes off to the seminary. This is before the Episcopal Church is ordaining women. She goes in at 73. They do not agree with that until 1976. And in beginning of 1977, she is ordained as the first African-American woman to be a priest at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. When I was working on an exhibition we've created called Imp Crusader Dude Priest, I charted her salaries and her income. It's like a roller coaster. I mean, That's the thing we have to remember, that despite all of these accomplishments, on the backside, there were also some very low moments, some very difficult times. And it was often, I think, faith that helped her continue to resist, continue to be resilient, to continue to go on. And so she does turn toward faith leadership at the end of her life, believing that while she's made some impact on the legal issues, that these are bigger issues, that they're moral issues, and that the church is the place to maybe have that platform to speak out about those issues.
Mm-hmm. And she struggled a bit with some mental illness issues also, in terms of, it seemed like every time she made a major breakthrough or she was involved in some major aspect, then her life would also kind of go crazy a little bit in terms of her ability to deal with all of this. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think that she struggled, that, her whole family had a sort of a history of issues around mental illness. Right. There was still a tremendous, and still today, tremendous amount of shame around those issues. She struggled with physical issues in her endocrinology, and when those were finally treated, and again, this was sort of at the same time that she met Irene, she began to be more productive because she was addressing some of those, but there were some very difficult moments, and those are also in her journal. And that's one of the things I appreciate about the new book, Jane Crow, is that it really tries to give us a realistic view of what it's really like to be an activist on the front line, that history is not a steady incline. Yeah. It looks a lot more like a roller coaster than that, and that part of our struggle, part of what we need to do is to figure out how to sustain ourselves through those difficult moments so that we can be there when we see some of our objectives met.
Let's take a phone call from Rachel in Suffolk. Hi, Rachel. You're on the air.
Oh, hi. Good afternoon.
Hi.
How are you all today?
Okay.
Thank you for taking my call. Actually, riding through, and I would be a first-time caller.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm passing through, and you asked the question, have you ever heard Pauli Murray before, and no, I haven't. But as I was listening and hearing her story, and then I'm driving and doing what I'm not supposed to be doing, looking at my phone while driving, but I'm reading a couple of things.
Be careful.
I do this so much. I drive so much that I can do so much while driving. But anyways, and that's not a good thing. Don't do it. Don't do what you hear on the radio. But I was just wondering, do you have any information on how is her work at all? Does it parallel with Dr. Joy? Was it Degree? I don't even know how to pronounce her name, but I just found out about her and the post-traumatic slavery disorder and Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and the Cress theory of color confrontation and racism, white supremacy. And I'm just wondering, these activist women are great, and I feel like where do we go? How do we pick up their work and continue it to this day? Hearing this woman's story just parallels my own in a couple of ways, especially with the constant up and down in income and having a couple of degrees and not seeing success, but just trying to work in the background and try to, make change. So I know that's maybe a tough question, especially if you're not familiar with those other two women.
Okay, well, let's let Barbara take a shot at that. Thanks, Rachel, for calling. And Rachel, please be careful. Put the phone down and just listen to the radio show, okay? Go ahead, Barbara. Were you familiar with who she mentioned?
Not specifically, but these ideas about passing on in generations of trauma and the trauma that we associate with racism and just sort of growing up Black in America. I mean, I think those are powerful. Again, these new women putting words and theory to long experience and knowledge in communities across the country. I would say that one of the things is we're beginning to see more places, more efforts focused on the brilliance of Black women. So here in North Carolina alone, we have the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice. We also have the Anna Julia Cooper Center at Winston-Salem, or at Wake Forest University. So people are beginning to understand that these are such important leaders that we need to really go back and take a look at their ideas, that their ideas still have such currency today, and that these places and efforts are ways to convene people, to talk with one another, to build on what we all know, to try to keep as the caller suggested, to try to keep this work going and to try to live into the vision of, Anna Julia Cooper was an 18th century woman. Pauli Murray is a 19th. There's a lot of women out there whose brilliance we need to begin to incorporate into our political strategies and our everyday lives.
And the interesting thing is that you learn from them, and I'm sure as they were going through the changes they went through, they never considered themselves to be leaders that we would come back and study at a later time. I mean, they were just trying to make it.
I think that's true, although I have to say Pauli Murray, we learned in her FBI file that in the course of her 75 years, she lived at 50 different addresses.
Wow.
Which is just astonishing, right? Talk about someone who's constantly on the move, whether it's for work or other issues. And yet she always carried these huge file cabinets with her. And now there are 2,700 folders of material at the Schlesinger Library for the History of Women at Radcliffe. So Pauli had some sense that what she was doing was important. She did write an autobiography, but I don't think that she really understood how important. And I appreciate people having, collecting and saving the materials that document their own lives so that we can learn from them later on. I mean, so many journals in there are what make this new biography just so deep and so detailed.
So Pauli was forced to retire as an Episcopal priest in 1982. And she didn't make a lot of money as a priest.
No, she never did. As they say, as the caller suggested, just because you get the degree doesn't mean you get the job, right?
Yeah.
So she was never called to be the rector of a church. She ministered to a lot of older folks or people facing chronic illness. She was a preached at churches across the region in Baltimore, in the Washington, D.C. area, in the Pittsburgh area, which is where she was living when she passed away in 1985. And she continued to write. One of the things that Patricia Bell Scott talks about is that when her book, one of her first books came out, and Some of Us Are Brave, the sort of really introductory reader to Black women's studies, she got a note from Pauli saying, you got to make sure you know about some of the women who've come before you. So Pauli was a constant correspondent in that way. Some of her younger relatives remember that they would write her letters, and the letters would come back with a letter from her and their letter corrected, right? So grammar and punctuation and spelling all, noted there in the margin. So I think she continued to be active as long as she could before she actually had cancer, and so did slow down at the very end. But literally, we've heard from people working at the archive that they were with her up until a couple weeks before she passed, going through these documents, getting them ready to take to the archive.
Oh, my gosh. So tell us about the Pauli Murray Project and about the center. What are you all doing there to advance Pauli's ideas and the ideals that she expressed?
So the Pauli Murray Project at the Duke Human Rights Center Franklin Humanities Institute started in 2009, and the idea was to begin to draw from Pauli Murray's notion that history could be a tool for social justice work through community dialogues, through documentary projects, through educational programs that by really helping people engage in the real past, the actual history, not necessarily what we tell ourselves about where we live or what's happening, that we could begin to catalyze some transformation and reconciliation. We then started to do some strategic planning, and out of that, in collaboration with a group called the Southwest Central Durham Quality of Life Project, which is a resident-driven effort, we determined that it was really important to try to actually save Pauli's childhood home here in Durham. And we were able to, in 2011, through a land bank that the Quality of Life Project had set up, buy the property and keep it. It was going to become a parking lot.
Oh, gosh.
So that started an effort to renovate the property, which took several years to get started for many reasons. But the idea being that we would have a national historic site devoted to Pauli Murray, that 50 locations in her history, so many people like Pauli on the move, not necessarily associated with one group or one place. It's so easy for them to drop off the landscape, physically drop off the landscape, no place to celebrate them. So given that this house was built in 1898 by Pauli's grandfather, it's a beautiful house that had managed to kind of hold on till we got there. We were able to purchase it and begin that renovation. And as you mentioned in your intro, we were named a national treasure by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And then in 2016, we received the designation as National Historic Landmark by the National Park Service. We do some programs there, but we aren't actually ready yet to welcome visitors every day. We hope to be open by 2020. We've got a ways to go in renovating the interior of the house and developing the plans for programming and getting the funding model set up so we can have ongoing staff and, welcome school kids and do workshops and all sorts of other things that we want to do there. So we think one significant thing is just having the place. Just having a place in the world where you can go and learn about Pauli Murray that celebrates this amazing woman of color who made such important contributions. In fact, when we look at historic sites and monuments across the country, the number of those sites focused on women of color is so tiny that this is a really significant designation. It's a significant place that we hope will encourage others to do the same thing. But the idea is to have a place and then to continue these programs that we've started through the Pauli Murray Project since 2009 to engage people in dialogue so they can learn from one another, to uncover stories like Pauli Murray's that are not as well known. We've commissioned an original play called To Buy the Sun. We've created an exhibition, Imp, Crusader, Dude, Priest, based on early selfies Pauli Murray took of herself and named, really great in an album of hers. But begin to once people learn about her, they ask themselves questions. Who else don't I know about? Mm-hmm. What does it mean to help create a world where someone like Pauli Murray can be an active, fully seen participant? So, we want to use history and education to catalyze and mobilize people for social justice.
And you're working within the community itself also in terms of issues of today. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, we're right around the corner from your favorite bread and breakfast here, Moorhead Manor, and it's a traditionally African-American working-class neighborhood that's really been challenged by gentrification. So we've been working with folks in the neighborhood. Tomorrow we're doing a workshop, an empowerment workshop on, the rights of tenants and, issues related to long-term residents in the neighborhood. And the Southwest Central Durham Quality of Life Project has been focused on that now for almost 20 years. So we are very much in partnership with them. Our efforts are very aligned, and we believe it's really important to be a good neighbor in all senses of that word, because our house is in a residential neighborhood, but to be engaged with issues on the ground right in our street, in our neighborhood, mm-hmm. and how much those reflect issues that are happening all over the country.
So we've got about 2 minutes left. What do you think was the overall driving force for Pauli? What kept her going? Because she could have stopped in so many different ways, but she kept pushing and she kept moving forward despite all the things that happened. So what do you think ultimately that driving force was?
She was very invested in what we could become, right? What she could become, what we as communities could become when it came to democracy, what we as communities of faith could become when it came to her chosen practice in Christianity. I think that this was imbued in her as a child, that was why we were on this planet, that we needed to stay in that process of becoming better, of reaching toward that ideal. And I also think that frustration that she had so much to offer, and yet it was not always welcomed. I think that the combination of a hope, tremendous hope, but also a foot in the real world, and anger and frustration based on knowing what difference she could make, and that it was not allowed, and that she was not alone. There were many people behind her. I also think she was just really, really smart. So she saw things and recognized things, and she couldn't help herself. She had to express them. Words were Pauli's weapons. She, in her poetry, in her writing, in her speeches, you see it over and over again. We find her really inspirational. We hope other people will. We also understand that it was important for Pauli to find love and acceptance, and that in those periods of her life, she was very, very productive. So taking care of ourselves, taking care of one another, as she said, suffering with and for one another, that was going to lead us to this better tomorrow, this better vision of what she called the new American.
Barbara Lau, you are a great advocate for Pauli Murray, and thank you so much for sharing this Another View history lesson with us. What is the website if people want to go find more information?
Thank you so much for asking. It's www.Pauli Murray Project, and that's Pauli Murray, Murray, project.org. And we'd be happy to add people to our mailing list and let you know what we're doing. And I hope, Barbara, when you're in Durham the next time, we get to meet face-to-face.
I promise I will be there. And thank you so much. And we will be right back.
Hi, this is Essie Patha-Murkerson from Law and Order. You are listening to Another View.
And welcome back. The name Martha Wash may leave you asking who, but the second you hear her bellow out the words, "Everybody dance now," or "It's raining men." Well, okay, I can't sing as well as she does, but you become instantly familiar with her rich and soulful sound. Wash is in Hampton Roads along with the Village People as headliners for this year's Pride Fest. She recently spoke to our Lisa Godley about the path that took her from gospel singer to pop legend.
You only thought you'd never heard of Martha Wash, but the twice Grammy-nominated songstress has led vocals for some of the most recognizable hits of the 80s and 90s, like CNC Music Factory's Sweat.
always knew that I wanted to sing. I just wasn't sure what genre it would be in. Naturally, my mother wanted me to sing gospel. And when I started singing with Sylvester professionally, and I told my parents, naturally they weren't happy, but I said, look, I've been singing gospel since I was a kid. I want to try this. I want to sing other types of music.
And sing she did. But you didn't see Martha Wash in the Black Box video singing the smash hit Everybody, Everybody. Instead, you saw a model lip-syncing to Wash's rich, powerful sound. A sound that catapulted the song to the top of the charts.
You won't belong to me, I let you down. I walk around and see your night skyline.
Wash says gospel will always be her foundation, but she followed her dream of singing all kinds of music and found herself auditioning as a backup singer for Sylvester, a life-changing moment she remembers well.
I went on and did the audition, and the girls that were still there, he dismissed them and told them that they could leave, and he hired me on the spot and asked me if I knew of anybody else that was as large as I was and that could sing, and I said yes, because I had been singing with Izora for years in a gospel group. So I brought her in, and, the rest is history.
The two women would later get their own record deal, marketing themselves as 2 Tons of Fun. Then came the offer they almost refused when they were asked to record It's Raining Men.
Paul Jabara and Paul Schaefer wrote It's Raining Men. And he invited Izor and myself and our managers over for lunch. He said, I want you to record this song. And we listened to the demo for it, and we kind of laughed. And he said, no, I really want you to record this song. And he went on to list the women who had turned down the song. And he told us that Donna Summer had turned it down, Barbara Streisand turned it down, Diana Ross turned it down. And we said, Paul, we can't record this song. Nobody's going to really buy this. And he said, no. He actually begged us to record this song. He said, I know this song is going to be a hit. And about 2 days later, we went in the studio and recorded the song in about 90 minutes and walked out of the studio and said, okay, Paul, see you later. And we went on about our business. We were working as 2 Tons of Fun and all that. And he was the one who really shot the song to the club DJs.
The song became a hit in clubs long before it was heard on the radio. It would rise to #1 on the U.S. disco chart and become an international hit, selling over 6 million copies worldwide. And Martha and Izora would perform it as the Weather Girls. Today, it's still a club favorite. The duo split in the late 80s, and Izora Armstead passed away in 2004. As a solo artist, Wash has recorded both ballads and pop music, not to forget numerous jingles as well as movie soundtracks. But she loves a live audience and can't wait to perform in Hampton Roads.
Just come out and have a real good time. Celebrate life, love, and who you are. Just celebrate yourself and the people around you, the people that love you. I really try to help people through music embrace themselves and love others, really as we all should.
For Another View, I'm Lisa Godley.
And WHRO will have a booth at Pride Fest, so come on out and say hello. We'll all be there. And we appreciate you spending the past hour with us. If you'd like to hear this show again or share it with a friend, please visit our website, anotherviewradio.org, and download the podcast. While you're there, please sign up for our eView newsletter, a once-a-week reminder of upcoming shows. You can also send us your show ideas at info@anotherviewradio.org. Next week, journalist, author, talk show host, and Another View Roundtable pundit, Will Leviste. His new book is called Dear Daughter, and you won't want to miss this personal tale of love and the fight for men's custody rights. Our theme music was composed and performed by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Victor Bowen is our audio engineer, and Trey Watson answered our phones. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Thank you so very, very much for listening to Another View.